All right, welcome back, everyone. Today we're having another SSPX conversation. Today we have Nathan, and Nathan reached out to me via email. Nathan, you want to introduce yourself and then kind of tell me what made you want to reach out?
Yeah. My name's Nathan. I live in Central Virginia, close to the SSPX seminary. I attend there with my family every Sunday, and um, I just thought it would be good to come on and kind of explain a little bit more what the SSPX actually like their positions are,
Hmm.
because a lot of people don't really engage with them, and so I thought it'd be
Hmm.
helpful.
Yeah, and of course there was a previous episode a couple weeks ago. Someone who is also an SSPX supporter, um, and I kind of opened the conversation with like, all right, here's some statements that the SSPX made regarding the Novus Ordo, and he kind of has his views are his own. So he's kind of saying, I don't quite agree with that. I don't quite go that far. I kind of believe this. Um, are you more of like, no, I'm willing to defend these statements that they made on their website, kind of as
Yeah,
far as that goes?
yeah, and it's interesting because like even a point of clarification, the SSPX is not and doesn't claim to be the church, and it's
Hmm.
not. It doesn't have a magisterium, so it's not like it has teachings,
Hmm.
but it does have positions, that they
Right.
believe
Yeah.
is kind of logical from the church's teachings,
Hmm.
and I tend to agree with them. Maybe I might disagree with a word here or there or some
Hmm.
conclusions, but when it comes to what we're discussing today about the new mass, I do find their arguments to be pretty convincing. So
Right. Okay. Yeah. So just as a fresh for the audience, this was kind of I found this article from Father Peter Scott, SSPX. So some of the language that he uses is he calls the Novus Ordo Mass objectively sacrilegious. He says even those who assist at them, uh, even if they're not aware of it, those who celebrate or assist at the new mass are necessarily in mortal sin. I think probably what he means is if they're aware it's mortal sin. Um, but having done something directly insulting to God, our divine Savior, the new mass still remains a sacrilege. It is still sinful in itself. It is never permitted to knowingly and willingly participate in an evil or sinful thing. It is not permissible for a traditional Catholic who understands that the new mass is insulting to our divine Savior to assist at the new mass, even if it is the only mass available. So, a very strong language from that. It seems to check out as far as I know. A lot of people are aware of the video they put out where they basically said you don't have to go to mass if you your only option is a Novus Ordo, right? So, kind of it tracks with that. Um, would you say you agree with all that, at least in substance?
you cut out there a little bit, but
Oh, okay.
yeah,
Do I need
essentially,
okay.
um,
Do I need
yeah.
to restate it or?
Well, I mean, I have it would be I have the text. I don't know, but yes,
Oh, okay.
essentially, I would agree with it. Again,
Mhm.
maybe you make a caveat here or there. Or one thing I would say is that this language, sacrilege,
Mhm.
never permitted to attend, insulting, is the strongest language. And I mean, like,
Mhm.
I'm speaking of somebody, like I said, who knows a lot of society priests and seminarians. It's the strongest language, and even some of their priests might say, "Well, I wouldn't necessarily use those same words, but
Mhm.
the essential kind of the idea, yes, I would agree with."
Sure. And would you say this is not specifically talking about liturgical abuse or deviation, but you would say the Mass of Paul VI, celebrated by the book, would still be maybe sacrilegious would be the word, or maybe sinful to attend. Is that would you go that far?
Yeah, so I think that the Mass of Paul VI in itself is poses a danger to souls,
Hmm.
um, and there are a lot of maybe caveats that I would give to that. Again, nuances that are helpful, but at the end of the day, I would say that the Mass itself, uh, because of its um, uh, Protestantizing nature,
Hmm.
is dangerous to souls, and so that's the danger is what is the sacrilege essentially.
Hmm.
Obviously, a mass in which there's liturgical abuse is happening is itself sacrilegious, um,
Hmm.
and in a greater degree, a much
Hmm.
greater degree. But Archbishop Lefebvre even talks about like even the mass celebrated piously because it has this spirit, this attitude. That's the danger that's there. So
Hmm.
I would be very comfortable with the word like the like dangerous, uh,
Dangerous. Okay.
um, sacrilegious comes from that, but
Hmm.
um, it's not so strong, if you will.
Yeah. Have you? I don't know if this is a common argument that maybe you heard before from Auctorum Fidei from Pius the Sixth. Have you heard of that before? Because
Um,
there's I know this has been shared before, but it's a condemnation. So it's Auctorum Fidei 1794. So it says it condemns the following: the church governed by the Holy Spirit could impose a disciplinary law that would not only be useless and more burdensome for the faithful than Christian liberty allows, but also dangerous and harmful. So it seems to be condemning the idea that the church can make a disciplinary law that is dangerous. And
yes,
people use that to basically try to say, so the church couldn't make a dangerous liturgy. What would you say to that?
yeah, I'm very familiar with that, and I think it's an important argument to consider. I mean, this is the
Hmm.
Holy Father, yeah,
Hmm.
and in the context, so he's condemning Jansenists, and the Jansenists were in, doing innovations in the liturgy, and they were saying that the traditional liturgy was the one that was dangerous, which
Hmm.
actually I think has a little bit of an implication about the situation today. But more directly to your question,
Hmm.
I would say that when taken with other statements from the Holy Fathers of the Church, we understand that the Church does not. Or I'll say this: it's disputed that the Church has a liturgical infallibility, and so one of the examples that would be given, right, is to say, well, if you could show that the Holy Father or the Church has promulgated liturgies or ceremonies that do have errors or are dangerous in other
Hmm.
ways, then it would kind of bolster the SSPX position.
Hmm.
And there is some evidence of that. So uh, the first one that comes to mind, I think the most egregious, or well, really these two are kind of up there, but um, for a long time in the divine office for the Feast of the Assumption, there was a reading that was falsely attributed to uh, Saint Jerome. Uh, Let me double check my notes on that. I think I have that correct. Um, yes, falsely attributed to Saint Jerome that actually denied the Assumption of Our Lady,
Hmm.
which is interesting. And it was in there for a long, long time. I think a
Hmm.
number of centuries before it was finally removed. Another example, just kind of to fill out the point a little bit,
Hmm.
is that for many centuries in the ordination of priests, it was understood in the liturgy that it was the bishop handing the sacred vessels, the paten and the host and the chalice
Hmm.
to the ordained priest that was part of the necessary form, and so that actually
Hmm.
preferred holy orders. But I think it was Pius XII. I could be mistaken, but I think it was a 20th century,
Hmm.
and I might be wrong about that. But condemned that and said actually it's not part of the form, and so it was a long held part of the liturgy, and
Hmm.
the rite itself is still there
Hmm.
in both the traditional and the new mass, but
Hmm.
it's understood to not be part of it. So it was a liturgical. A wrong liturgical understanding that had been taught for many, many years.
Hmm.
So I don't think that we can extend the church's infallibility to say that every one of her disciplines
Hmm.
that she imposes at any time is good for the church,
Sure, sure.
good for the faithful. And I think we can even say that there are instances in the history of the church where they pose a certain danger, and then when you have this kind of cumulative argument,
Hmm.
that's kind of what shows the danger in the new mass.
Right. And would you see, because it's actually kind of interesting, because I would probably place a liturgical rite as a little bit higher than discipline in a way. I don't know. It's not doctrine, but discipline. When I think of discipline, I think of like, oh, changing fasting before communion from 3 hours to one. Like that's more of discipline versus promulgating a new missal, right? Um, so your position would be though that the church could promulgate a missal that is dangerous, like the missal itself is dangerous.
So, yes, I think this is one of the things that Archbishop Lefebvre leaned on a lot is that,
Mhm.
with the fact there is no argument, um, it's not an easy decision to come to. And he himself, I use him as an example because, well, obviously he started the society, but
Sure. Yeah.
um, he, in the mind of the society, he really navigated the crisis very well. Um, Not to mention his personal piety, of course, but um, he was um, as, if not more, cautious about the possibility that the church could do this than anybody else. But it was the overwhelming evidence from the mass itself, from the things surrounding it, and from the teachings of those
Hmm.
who pushed it forward and who helped
Right.
create it, that convinced him to the contrary. That yes, apparently it is the case.
Hmm.
Um, I want to clarify this: the position of the society is not that the new mass is dangerous because of some positive declaration of heresy. The new mass is not heretical. Archbishop Lefebvre
Hmm.
said that.
Okay.
He did say that it favored heresy, and I have some kind of argument, some explanations for that idea that
Okay.
I can
Yeah.
go to in a second. But he said that it favored heresy, basically that it obscured the traditional teaching of the church about the mass and the priesthood and about the Eucharist.
Hmm.
Um, but he doesn't say that it's heretical. He doesn't say that it's invalid. I mean, we have to kind
Hmm.
of ring that bell a lot. People
Yeah. Yeah.
realize that the new
Hmm.
mass is valid, and because of its validity, there is this great reverence and this great care that we have to take towards this issue.
Hmm.
In the Eucharist, our Lord Jesus Christ is really and truly present, and He's really and truly present at every validly celebrated new mass.
Hmm.
And in that case, with that in mind, our Lord is present in a way that He can give the graces to souls that He wants. So we don't, as SSPX faithful, we don't believe that Novus Ordo Catholics are less Catholic than we
Sure.
are, or that
Okay.
that because you go to this mass, you are a bad Catholic or you're a bad person. You, whoever the royal you is in this
Hmm.
case, but
Yeah.
like
Yeah. Yeah.
the understanding that it's the new mass itself that has tended towards this error or this lack of clarity that is really dangerous.
Hmm. Okay, and that's interesting that you brought up. Okay, it's very good that you clarify all of that. The way we were clear on like what you're not saying. Um, so something you said earlier was it's not so much a positive element. So it's not like the Novus Ordo has this error in it. It's more about like the Novus Ordo either like lacks this essential part or it makes this important part too ambiguous that it could be easily misinterpreted. Something like that.
Yeah,
What would be a couple examples of that that you would say are the most like obvious or easy to explain?
yeah, because it's not like the new mass. Like, I mean, I have the missal right here. It's not like it says, "And then Christ did not rise from the dead." It's
Right.
like
Yeah,
it's
exactly.
not
Yeah. Yeah.
like that. But there are
Mhm.
what we would describe as deficiencies.
Okay.
Um, there's a lot of places I could go with this, and like I'm not going to harp on
Mhm.
uh, um, the last guy you had on too much, but the last gospel I don't think is the most important of these things. I think that the real
Okay. Yeah. Yeah.
things, the real core things. So the theology of the Mass, as it was clarified in the canons and decrees of the Council of Trent, and as it's been described by theologians, is that the Mass is the propitiatory sacrifice, and the propitiatory sacrifice of the Mass, that means that it's saving. That
Hmm.
means that Christ is the victim, the priest who offers himself, and so there's essential parts of the sacrifice. It goes back to the Old Testament. I'm going to shorten this, but
Hmm.
basically, you have the offertory, the immolation, and the consuming of the sacrificial victim. And in all three of those parts, those essential parts of the Mass, there has been a radical change. Most obviously is the offertory. So I would see the offertory as being gutted. Um,
Hmm.
uh, if you look at the two side by side, and I would encourage anybody who is watching to do this, get the Novus Ordo Missal and open up to the what is called in the new translation, it is called an offertory, although in other translation it hasn't been, which is really scary. Um, in fact, actually, in this one it says presentation and preparation of the gifts. It doesn't say offertory, but
Hmm.
it's a Jewish mealtime prayer. Blessed are you, Lord God of all creation, for through your goodness we have received the bread. We offer you fruit of the earth and work of human hands. It will become for us the bread of life. And very similarly, blessed
Hmm.
are you, Lord God of all creation. Receive this wine. We offer you fruit of the vine and work of human hands. It will become our spiritual drink. Um,
Hmm.
there's no divine sacrifice that's presented in the offertory of the new mass. It does have the word offer. we offer you, work of human hands we offer you, which
Hmm.
in my mind, now maybe this is a stretch, but in my mind, really harkens back to Cain, the sacrifice of human hands offered to God.
Hmm.
Whereas the teaching from the Council of Trent and from the theologians of the church and St. Thomas
Hmm.
is that the sacrifice of the Mass is the sacrifice of Christ mediated through the priest to us. So it appeases God and it gives grace to us. This is men reaching up and saying, here's the work of human hands, this bread and this spiritual drink, which is also
Hmm.
ambiguous. I'm not going to read the traditional offertory because it's too long, but
Hmm.
there's a lot of theology there that kind of explains the offertory.
Right.
Um, Putting a pin in that for a second, the Roman canon, the Council of Trent also talks about the Roman canon. I could read that. I'm not going to go to the whole
Hmm.
thing, but it basically talks about um, um, the centuries ago, which is so free from error that it contains nothing that does not in the highest degree savor of a certain holiness and piety and raise up to God the minds of those who offer it. It goes on. The sense about the Roman canon that it's inerrant. I mean, it says without error, um, from the inspiration of the apostles, the pontiffs, the councils of the church,
Hmm.
and the new mass not only made it optional, but also changed the Roman canon. Now, changing the Roman canon itself in principle is permissible. I mean, Pius XII talks about this. John the 23rd
Hmm.
did it. These things,
Adding Saint Joseph to the canon, right?
yeah,
Yeah.
these things are in principle permissible.
Hmm.
Um, there's no precedence that I'm aware of in any of the rites of the church, east or west, that allows for these alternate Eucharistic prayers, like alternate
Hmm.
canons. You have a canon, and then you have like the
Hmm.
option, which is kind of, if
Hmm.
you know the definition of the word canon, it's kind of contradictory to have a
Right.
canon
Yeah.
and an alternate, because
Hmm.
the canon is the rule, it's the standard. And so you have Eucharistic prayer number two, which is painfully short and says very little of the doctrine,
Hmm.
says very little of offering and sacrifice. It really has this strong meal emphasis at the expense of the
Hmm.
propitiatory sacrifice.
Hmm.
Um, but in that, even in the Roman canon, in the new Mass, it's changed. So it gives the option to remove most of the saints, which is funny. John the 23rd added Saint Joseph. We love Saint Joseph. Great.
Hmm.
That's his prerogative. But Paul the Sixth removed, like, didn't remove, but gave the option to remove
Hmm.
many of the saints from the Roman canon,
Hmm.
um, which is really sad. And then touch the words of consecration. Now, this is a very sensitive topic because um, the church understands a certain prerogative that there's like a bare minimum in the words of consecration that make a valid mass, but it also teaches that the words of consecration are from Christ. And so the words of consecration were edited slightly in the new mass to take Mysterium Fidei from the middle of it, which has significance, and separates it. And now it's not part of the words of consecration; it happens immediately after, and it's used as an introduction to the what do they call it? The proclamation,
Memorial acclamation.
the memorial acclamation. Thank you.
Yeah. Hmm.
Mysterium Fidei, the mystery of faith, and then you have one of three options, which, not to mention, I really don't think it's appropriate to have the laity interjecting in the canon. But again,
Hmm.
maybe preference, maybe something substantial. I don't
Hmm.
know. But to have the part of the words of consecration separated from it, that's really so. So far, we have the offertory. I would say
Hmm.
gutted. Really, um, I promise I'm going to wrap up soon. Uh,
Okay. Yeah.
the Roman canon, and then the communion. The priest's communion is moved back in the from the old mass and the where it's at basically immediately after the canon. You have the preparation, and then you have the the reception of Holy Communion. In the new mass, there's a separation so that it puts it with the communion of the faithful, which seems to imply that the communion of the faithful has a greater importance. Which again, Council of Trent very clearly states that the communion of the faithful, while desirable, is in no way necessary. I'm going to wrap
Hmm.
up my thoughts there, although I
Sure.
could
Sure.
say
Okay.
more.
Yeah. No, those are, I guess, three really good examples. Um, what I would say on the offertory part, so like they changed it, and you could maybe even argue like it was better before or whatever. Um, I don't find it to be problematic, I guess, because it uses the phrase "bread of life," which that's a phrase in our tradition, right? That's
Mhm.
a common phrase used to refer to the Eucharist. It's not saying like if it just said to offer you this bread that we eat, I think it did a good job of at least maintaining that. And spiritual drink, like maybe that's not a common phrase. I guess I've not heard that anywhere else. Um, so I could see why that's like okay, that's not as good. I guess I just don't see it as dangerous in the sense that I is when you say dangerous, do you mean like when someone hears that they might not understand the importance of what's going on? Is that how you
I,
would go about
I
it?
would say that partially, and briefly, I would say that when I talk about the danger, I am making a cumulative argument. So
Mhm. Okay,
I
yeah.
I don't think you can prove that if the church had just changed the offertory that it would be dangerous, or if it
Mhm.
had just. But it's all how these things tie together.
Altogether. Sure, sure, sure. Um, on the canon, or I guess the Eucharistic prayer option, I guess in the same regard, I guess I'm wondering, is it the fact that the faithful is like, for example, Eucharistic prayer 2 is very short, it's very kind of stripped down just to like the very necessary elements, right? Would that also be, and of course I know it's cumulative, but when you say dangerous, do you mean dangerous for the faithful to hear that? Or do you just mean it's dangerous that the priest didn't say the longer form? I guess that's kind of I'm trying to understand what it means for it to be dangerous.
I think I would be if I were to be a little bit more precise, I would say it's dangerous because, or maybe for two reasons, because it by implication regards the traditional understanding of the canon as kind of null and void, which is affecting the church's teaching. Like that's kind of implying that the church was wrong about these things for these
Mm,
many centuries. Um, and then, in a certain sense, yes, it's dangerous because the people are hearing it because the prayers do not communicate what is happening. Like again,
mhm,
to say something that the SSPX does say about the new mass is the propitiatory sacrifice.
mhm. Right,
Problem
yeah.
is that the new mass doesn't seem to recognize itself as that.
Mm.
Um, that's one way of framing it. Maybe
Sure.
you don't, but
Okay. No, I think I'm following. I think I'm following. Um, I guess what I would say to that, so if a person because if you think about it in the TLM, a person in the pews isn't hearing anything, right? Because the priest is praying the Roman canon, but he's doing it silently.
mhm.
Versus in the Novus Ordo, let's say he prays Eucharistic prayer too, isn't the person in the pew, all else being equal, still receiving more understanding of what's going on in the second case because they're hearing something versus in the TLM, like yes, the priest is saying the full canon, but you're not hearing anything, right? If it's about danger to the faithful, why is that one more dangerous than the other in your mind?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I really like that because it frames the issue in a really good way. So
Mm,
the principal issue is not um, yeah, because technically a priest who's celebrating the Latin mass could get away with like just skipping saying the prayers, and
sure.
like we wouldn't
Yeah.
know. That'd
Right.
be
Yeah.
not an abuse. Like that would be like a grave offense.
Yeah.
You
Yeah.
know,
Yeah. Mhm.
um, it's not our knowledge of the mystery that makes it's about. Firstly, it's about how we glorify God, and it's about the reality of the truth being communicated in the words themselves. And so it's not so much, oh, do I hear every time I go to mass Eucharistic prayer being number one being prayed or the Roman canon being prayed. That's not so much the matter. It's is that being prayed because the mass itself is what we're talking about. And the danger to the faithful is somebody who cares enough to read them. If you just like read, well, if you were to read both masses next to each other, but even if
Mhm.
you were to just read the Roman canon next to Eucharistic prayer number two,
Mhm.
it shows that like Eucharistic prayer number two is just missing so much. Uh,
Mhm.
uh, and then again, reiterating my point from before, it's mostly that it's touching the sacrificial nature because there's the immolation of the victim.
Mhm.
Christ is symbolically dead. He's not literally dead. He's really and
Mhm.
truly alive on the altar.
Mhm.
But by this double consecration, the separation of the bread and the wine, consecrated both body and blood, he dies on the altar in a symbolic way, in a metaphorical way. And so that's the immolation. And so we're touching, we're saying this immolation, we're just not going to make it so clear in the text. And again,
Hmm.
if you read it, it's like, uh, you know, talking about the dew and it's just not very, it doesn't say very much.
Hmm. Okay, so when you say it's dangerous to the faithful, it's not even so much that like person A goes to Latin Mass, person B goes to Novus Ordo. This person going to Novus Ordo is more likely to apostatize because they're hearing Eucharistic prayer too. It's not, you're not really quite saying that. You're saying
No, no.
something
And
else. Okay.
what I would say that might be along that line, and this is kind of the prudential judgment of SSPX priests that would say
Hmm.
it seems like, and it also does seem to be the case statistically, that people who go to the new mass over time will inculcate these ideas that are not Catholic. The
Hmm.
idea that the Mass is not a propitiatory sacrifice and it's firstly a meal, or the idea that it's a sacrifice of praise but not of salvation. You know, all these Protestant ideas, and that over time may inculcate those. But it's not like, oh, you go to the Mass and like you leave and you're just a heretic, right? Like
Hmm.
that's not the
Yeah,
idea.
I get that. Yeah, that. So of course, this is purely anecdotal. I can't prove this, but like for example, I grew up going to the Novus Ordo. I never, as a kid, I always knew it was really. I didn't know what propitiatory sacrifice meant as a kid, but I did know. Okay, this is really Jesus on the altar. Something happens on the altar. It's not just bread. That's because my parents catechized me well and told me, "Hey, this is what's going on here," and I suspect that's the case in the TLM, right? Like if, especially if a kid's not hearing anything, it's going to require catechesis outside of mass. Um, but it seems like maybe you're saying over time there's going to be a disconnect between okay, my parents told me this, but what the priest's saying doesn't quite sound like that, and it creates a. Is that kind of where you're getting at, or?
I think that's a big part of it. So, like, for example, transubstantiation, the word is not in the Mass. It
Mm-hmm.
is all throughout the Council of Trent.
Mm-hmm.
Um, it's not. It was not in the original version of the general instructions on the Roman Missal, except as a footnote referencing the Council of Trent,
Mm-hmm.
which is kind of really unfortunate. But there's things that undermine in the new Mass the belief in the transubstantiation. And one of those things that I find really striking, and some people, this doesn't mean much to them, or they don't kind of feel motivated by this. I find this personally very convicting. In the traditional Mass, there are 14 genuflections in a low Mass that the priest does, and
Mm-hmm.
in the new Mass, there's three. Um, it tells something to the child who's even if the priest is celebrating mass ad orientem in Latin, all these things,
Mm-hmm.
beautiful, beautiful things that a lot of Novus Ordos do. Not the majority, not even a large minority,
Mm-hmm.
but there are a number.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Speaking of which, we need to pray for the Diocese of Charlotte right now. But um, when the priest he's not allowed to genuflect at these times, or when the priest did in the old mass,
Mm-hmm.
um, it communicates something. Like, and again, this could
Mm-hmm.
be easily blown out of proportion, right? Because then you could say, well, there should be 25
Right.
genuflections.
I was going to go there. So yeah, yeah.
Like, it's
Mm-hmm.
not, the point is not to say what's the right number of
Mm-hmm.
genuflections. The point is to say, if we look at those points where those genuflections are and the point where they're taken out, it seems really to communicate and undermine this teaching. So if a young kid is in the back and he
Mm-hmm.
just sees that, it's like, man, I mean, I've heard test people tell. I was going to say testimonies. Maybe that's too strong of a word, but people tell me
Mm-hmm.
stories about growing up and be like, "Oh, you know, you guys Protestants saying this, like, oh, you guys believe that that's really Jesus. Why are you standing at all? You know, you should be on your face, right?"
Mm-hmm.
And but they go to the traditional mass. I've heard these stories, and they're like, "Wow, I can tell these people really have a convicted belief that Christ is present there." And
Mm-hmm.
I was Protestant. I came in through the new mass. I'm very grateful for the for my priest. I'm very grateful for the church that I came into.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but when I started going to the traditional mass, I there is a marked difference there, and the belief is in the rubrics, and I
Mm-hmm.
don't think it's in the new mass.
Gotcha. Yeah, no, that's fair. Yeah, I think there is some truth to the idea of like you can look at two different masses, and one of them it's just like it's very obvious that something important is going on, whereas the other one it's not. Um, Maybe if I were to make an argument against the extreme on that is like if you go to a papal high mass versus a low mass, like one's going to look more seriously than the other, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the low mass is like going to undermine your faith, right? So I would say that, but I also do totally get what you're saying as far as you replace a genuflection with a bow. Is that either consciously or subconsciously going to make you kind of over time like not under it's going to make it easier to not believe. Maybe is that the way
Yeah,
you'd put it?
yeah, and there's two things I would say. First of all,
Mhm,
I love the example of the papal high mass, pontifical high mass. I mean, we're
mhm,
privileged. We have a solemn high mass almost every Sunday. Like it's beautiful, and then there's a low mass in the morning. There's all these options you can go to.
mhm,
There's a difference. We're not saying that the new mass isn't is dangerous because it's not pretty enough or it doesn't have
mhm,
enough pomp and circumstance, because you could have a pontifical high new mass and a low mass celebrated,
mhm,
in a side chapel. Um,
mhm.
we would say that we think that there's a preference uh, for the traditional mass in that
Right, and
instance.
I get that on principle, but I would still say that if someone were to look at those two, they would probably come out thinking like a kid obviously would probably look at that and understand something really important is going on in this one, and the other one it kind of seems like there's a guy just praying by himself. Like that's
Yeah,
something that you could potentially happen, right? Like,
yeah, I could see that, especially like if you went to one mass, right? Like if that
mhm,
was or the two masses, you went to one and the other.
mhm,
Um, um, I can't remember my other thought about that, but yeah, I just it's not about the number of beautiful things or how
mhm,
pretty the vestments are. Like those things matter. They really do matter.
mhm,
But they're not where we disagree, because the new mass can have just as beautiful vestments, unless you're in the Diocese of
mhm,
Charlotte. It can have just as beautiful,
mhm.
like, I really don't mean to dig. I feel very
No, I
terrible
got
there.
it. It's topical.
But,
It's topical. So yeah, I get
um,
it.
so, but
Yeah,
my,
that's fair.
it's like,
So the third one you brought up was the consecration prayer, the Mysterium Fidei. So this one I need to look into more because correct me if I'm wrong. In the any does Jesus say that in any of the Gospels in
no,
the institution narratives?
yeah, this is an interesting point. So, um, and this is something that I need to study as well more. I'm no
Mhm,
theologian or expert.
mhm,
Um, but yeah, in the canon of the Mass, it says that it quotes Mysterium Fidei as part of it, um,
right.
and there's different translations in the things, but none of the Gospels that I'm aware of include that phrase right
Mhm,
there.
mhm,
Uh, but it is the teaching of the Council of Trent that the Roman canon is without error, and
mhm,
there are certain things. Like the belief that the apostles started the tradition of receiving on the tongue, which we could talk about too. Um, the Council of Trent refers to that as an apostolic tradition. So we are obliged. Um, I'm not a theologian, so I don't know what level of
mhm,
obligation, but we have at least, I would say, a religious submission of intellect and will. Seems to me to believe that the apostles started the tradition of receiving Holy Communion on the tongue.
okay.
That's my understanding, and I could be
Yeah.
mistaken.
Mhm,
I think that this have a similar weight, so I think it's to be understood that the that it's omitted from the Gospels, but
mhm.
it's what our Lord said.
I see. So the argument goes, Council Trent says the canon is without error. The canon lists Mysterium Fidei as the word spoken by Jesus. Therefore, Jesus really did say that at the Last Supper, even though it wasn't written down.
I
Is kind
think
of
that's the case, and
okay.
I'm not
Gotcha.
going to die on that hill. I would be corrected on that, but
Yeah.
that's my
Well,
understanding.
I've heard Sedevacantists make this kind of argument, so I'm somewhat familiar. I think I know the. I've heard of that anyway.
I don't like being compared to Sedevacantists.
No, no. Well, but
I'm
they
just
would
kidding.
say
I'm just
taking they would say
Yes,
taking Mysterium Fidei makes it invalid. So like obviously you're
yes,
not going there.
yes,
Um,
exactly.
my hunch though is that the reason the reformers changed this is because well this wasn't listed in the gospel, so we're gonna take it out to make it so that he's saying what he said in the gospel. But we're still gonna keep it in because it's important. I don't know. That's just me like spitballing about what it could be,
Mhm.
versus just removing it and saying like, oh, like this is a bad thing. We're getting rid of this. I don't see a like malicious reason for rearranging it versus what is their motivation other than they just think, oh, this makes more sense.
That's an interesting question. I don't know their motivation. I know the motivation, the explicit motivation of Monsignor Bunini when he was making these changes, but I don't know about the reference to this
Hmm.
change. What I do know is that the church is to have a high reverence for her, for these things that are passed down,
Hmm.
these traditions,
Hmm.
and pontiffs are obliged to pass on the traditions that are from the apostles and the traditions that come from them. And the Council of Trent says that this comes from the apostles. It's really, really scary to me to say, well, it's not in the gospel, so we can change it. And if I may, I'm not going to quote this, but I would encourage everybody to go read Mediator Dei by Venerable Pius XII. Um, and starting in like number 57 and going on to like 65 or something like that, he talks about the prerogative of the Roman pontiff to change the liturgy. And a lot of people read one line in here. It says, it follows from this that the sovereign pontiff alone enjoys the right to recognize and establish any practice touching the worship of God, to introduce and approve new
Hmm.
rites, as to modify those he judges require modification, period. And then they don't read anything else. Um, I would encourage people to go read that because it's a very
Hmm.
pressing thing, because he's the Pope before the big changes. Well, technically two popes before,
Hmm.
but before the Second Vatican Council. Um, and if you read everything that he says in the paragraph before and the paragraphs after, he's condemning that antiquarianism, the antiquarianism that says, oh, well, the church father said this church father said this, and this scripture verse said this, and this, that, and that. And so we need to bring that back into the liturgy today. And if
Hmm.
you read 59, 60, 61, and some of these other paragraphs, he condemns that exact attitude, saying that I can't remember the word. He uses some strong word about it, but basically that it needs to be avoided at all costs. Um, and so he's condemning this idea that we can just go back and like look at the liturgy at the Last Supper and use
Hmm.
that as our model and forget about the tradition, because
Hmm.
antiquarianism, which the church strongly condemns and the society
Hmm.
very strongly condemns, says what's oldest is best.
Hmm.
And traditionalism, this is an oversimplification, but says
Hmm.
what has been preserved is what is best. What has been handed down from generation to
Hmm.
generation is what we have to hold to. And so he's basically saying we shouldn't go willy nilly and change these um, rights.
Right. Because it's interesting. I've had some traditionalists that are very bold in the way, and they kind of overstate their position. It's where they basically just say the oldest is the best.
Yeah.
But it's interesting because you mentioned the Last Supper. Like, if you were to look at the Last Supper, it's probably very stripped down in terms of how much
Yes.
was going on there. Like, if you think about it, and like sometimes I'll see a tradition online be like, changing it from nine Kyries to six made it evil, and I'm like,
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
they,
Yeah.
they may have said none at the Last Supper for all we know. Like that's just a silly argument. Um, but there is some truth to the in terms of the people who say like taking any if there's something good in it and you take it out that necessarily makes it bad, and I don't think that's true.
Yeah.
You're
Yeah.
not saying that though. You're talking about here's a very essential mystery that we are kind of diluting, right?
Yeah, and when you do that a lot, it starts to raise some concerns. I
Hmm.
found the one quote, the second quote
Okay.
from Mediator Day that I thought was really helpful for this, and I also think it references was it Pius the Sixth who was talking about condemning the Jansenists for saying that the liturgy could,
Hmm.
could be wrong. Um, Pius the XII says the Church is without question a living organism, and as an organism, in respect of the sacred liturgy, also, she grows, matures, develops, adapts, and accommodates herself to temporal needs and circumstances, provided only that the integrity of her doctrine be safeguarded.
Hmm.
This notwithstanding the temerity and daring of those who introduce novel liturgical practices or call for the revival of obsolete rites out of harmony with prevailing laws and rubrics deserve severe reproof. So a couple of
Mhm.
things that he says there. Church is a living organism. Yes, she should adapt and accommodate herself to the real, legitimate temporal needs and circumstances,
Mhm.
provided only that the integrity of her doctrine be safeguarded. Which, first of all, seems to imply to me that he is envisioning, at least in principle, that the integrity of her doctrine might not be safeguarded by certain changes
Mhm.
possible. And then he says basically the daring of those who introduce novel liturgical practices or call for the revival of obsolete rites out of harmony, out of harmony with prevailing laws and rubrics deserve severe reproof.
Mhm.
That's some of the biggest justifications for the changes in the new mass were, oh, this mealtime prayer was ancient Jewish prayer that would have been used at the
Mhm.
time of our Lord. He may have even prayed it at the Last Supper, so we should bring it back. And everything like the chasubles, like the Gothic chasubles that we see now,
Mhm.
the circle ones, the
Mhm.
ponchos, are inspired from the older ones. It's this antiquarianism that says,
Mhm.
let's go back and find this old thing and just do it again.
Mhm.
Pius XII is condemning that. So I'd say we should be really careful about introducing novel liturgical practices.
Gotcha. That's good. I'll have to read all that in context. That's
Yeah, yeah,
interesting.
for sure. Don't take my word
Um,
for it.
yeah, exactly. You did mention Bunini earlier. I know there is a famous quote, though. Some of my research shows it's kind of taken out of context, but where he just talks about removing every stumbling block for Protestants, right? My understanding is that this was spoken specifically in the context of the Good Friday liturgy about referring to Protestants as heretics and schismatics and about like reforming that. But putting that aside, um, let's suppose that that's really what Bunini's goal was to make it Protestant or like acceptable to Protestants. I
Acceptable to
guess
Protestants.
yeah, it's I guess in my mind it's like I just if that was his goal, I don't feel like he really succeeded because yes, the Novus Ordo does resemble a Protestant liturgy more than a TLM does because it's more similar.
Mm-hmm.
But a Protestant who objects to Catholicism who goes to a Novus Ordo is not going to be like, "Oh, this is actually pretty nice." It's going to be like, "Wait, they're still praying to Mary and the saints, and they're still doing this and that, and like, what is going on?" Um, I guess I just don't see it as like, "Oh, we've removed everything that's Catholic from the liturgy," because I think a Protestant who is objectionable to Catholicism is still going to see a lot of things in the Novus Ordo that they're going to object to, right?
Yeah. So you're a cradle Catholic, right?
I am, yeah. Mhm.
Okay. So I was raised in a Calvinist Presbyterian church,
Mhm.
very devout Protestant family. Um, and I, um, studied Protestant apologetics and was very interested in debating Catholics, especially when I started meeting them, thinking,
Mhm.
"Wow, I'm going to really convert y'all really fast." Um, it didn't work out so well for me, or I guess it did. Um, when this is an anecdote, it's whatever. But
Yeah, yeah, of course. Yeah.
first time I went to the new mass, the first time I went to mass that I could remember was with a friend, and I had very anti-Catholic sentiments. And I remember going and very early on in the mass thinking, oh, actually, this isn't that bad because it's pretty similar to what we do. Now, I want to say with full humility, God works in mysterious ways, and I'm very grateful for the way that He, because I don't know with my, you know, um, attitude
Mhm.
if if I'd like gone straight to a TLM, if I would have been Catholic as quick.
Sure, yeah.
I think I probably would have been, but it felt good to feel welcomed in the Catholic Church as a Protestant.
Mhm.
There is good there. I want to acknowledge that.
Okay, yeah, yeah.
However, it's really dangerous to use that as a principle for the liturgy in which we are principally supposed to be honoring God. Um,
As opposed to like evangelizing, right?
yes, yeah,
Mhm.
Protestants like de facto cannot worship God, um, because worship of God in the strict sense is truly what happens at the Mass. It's Calvary. It's when
Mhm.
our Lord Jesus Christ, the only true priest, offers himself on the altar of the cross to the Father. Um, so to try to appease the Protestants, if you study classical Protestantism, so I'm not talking about like modern evangelical non-denom
Mhm.
churches. That's a whole
Yeah,
other
yeah.
conversation. But classical Protestantism, and you look at especially the reforms that they made, like what Martin Luther changed in the Mass to make it acceptable to have his Lutheran Mass,
Mhm.
and what Calvin changed to have their Calvinist liturgy, their Calvinist ceremony originally. And the most famous example is Cranmer, right? After
Mhm. Anglican, right?
after
Or
the
yeah.
Anglican church was founded by Henry VIII. Um, if you look at the changes, it's really uncomfortable how, if you look at them side by side, I mean, things from communion in the hand, removing the communion rails, priest facing the people, the vernacular, but then the offertory was changed, just all these
Mhm.
prayers were changed, and then eventually the ordination of priests was changed, and all these
Mhm.
things that, if you look at them side by side, it's really uncomfortable. And so
Mhm.
I went to an Anglican church for a short period of time. I have good friends who are Anglican to this day. I love you if you're on here. Sorry about saying you can't worship God, but it's true. Um, but um, uh, if you talk to somebody who has traditional Anglican convictions, or if you talk to somebody like RZ, um, although he might not be the best example, but if you talk to somebody who has really traditional Anglican convictions and they go to the Novus Ordo, especially, they would have like no objections, like
Mhm.
virtually none.
Mhm.
Um, a lot of Lutherans don't have objections to the new mass. If you look at Protestants at the time, like in the late '60s and early '70s, when it was coming about,
Mhm.
those Protestants were pretty happy with it. Now, the Protestants who talked about it would have been the more liberal Protestants, right?
Mhm.
But that's even more concerning that like liberal Protestants are like, yeah, this is great. Like we
Mhm.
love, like that's really scary. Now, I'm not saying that every Protestant, and I don't think this was Booni's intention, that like every Protestant could just walk in and just be like, cool,
Mhm.
but it did move in that direction, and I
Sure.
think he was successful in doing that.
So as far as the a Protestant going to the TLM, I guess I'm trying to think. Would they find it more objectionable, or would they just kind of be like unsure what's going on?
So
That's kind of a rhetorical. Like I'm wondering myself, but I'm curious to hear what
I've
you think.
taken I've taken a couple of friends who are Protestants, like from a couple different levels of interest in Catholicism. So some of my Anglican friends that I referenced earlier, I've taken them to the
Hmm.
TLM. They had a real interest in it because of the beauty and
Hmm.
the Latin. They thought it was really, cool. But they weren't reading every word of the missal, and so again, it's like
Right.
you
Yeah.
can
Yeah.
go to the mass once and think anything. I mean, you
Hmm.
can go to mass, but I've, in my personal experience, limited personal experience, like bringing people to the seminary here. I've had a lot of Protestants, so
Hmm.
we're right by Liberty University. Um, I'm kind of outing myself here, but my wife went to Liberty for a little while, which was interesting as a Catholic. But
Hmm.
there's a lot of people come from Liberty who we brought, and they really liked it. A number of them have become Catholic since then. Um, so I've
Hmm.
seen fruits in my life personally. I was just sitting. We had a friend over for dinner who's a recent convert as of like 2 months ago, and she was like, "I wasn't sure when I was going to the Novus Ordo churches. I wasn't sure about being Catholic, but when I went to this Latin mass, I was convinced like immediately." Um, Anecdotally, I think it really helps, but that's
Yeah.
even coming from somebody who went to the new mass and came into the church in the new mass. So
Yeah, I
I
gotcha. Yeah, I would say as far as my personal position on this, I think that the TLM should be accessible, much more accessible for everyone. I think it should be, an option. I do think, kind of based on what you said, the idea that the Novus Ordo, an Anglican could come and kind of be like, oh, this feels at home. Yes, that does sound very strange because it sounds like we're like stooping down to their level almost. But there is something true about this. If that gets their foot in the door, that can maybe be one strategy, right? Versus the TLM, it's almost like a Protestant could come in and be like, I don't know what's going on here, but this is very beautiful. And then over time, they are maybe absorbing a little more theology. You know, some of the very strong language used at the altar becomes more palatable over time. So it's like
Mhm.
I can see both methods. I think it's fine to say the TLM is better. I'm kind of like it really does depend on the person because I know some people who really that's what brought them in versus other people, more traditional liturgy brought them in. That's why I say the option should be there more, basically for both forms. That's kind of my opinion, but um, it sounds like we're kind of agreeing. But I would, you're definitely more on the side of like, no, this is the tried and true, and it's not worth the potential danger of the Novus Ordo.
Yeah, yeah. I would. Uh, I've thought about this a lot. If I granted, which I don't think that this is the case, but if I granted for a hypothetical conversation with somebody who just believed that the Novus Ordo was better at converting Protestants,
Mhm,
if I was talking with somebody who said that, um, I would say something like, I would rather have a liturgy that clearly communicates what the Catholic Church is, but maybe has worse numbers at converting Protestants than a liturgy that's so watered down that a Protestant kind of can just slide into it. Because I didn't realize it's kind of this like bell curve. At first, when I was researching Catholicism, I thought Catholicism and I were way off. It was like, I'm a Christian, then there's you're a Catholic. Those are the
mhm,
two sides of the coin, right? Um, you worship Mary, you all the whatever stupid
mhm,
things. And then as I was becoming closer, I thought, man, Catholicism is just another branch of Christianity. We're brothers in Christ. They have some traditions that are a little too much, but we're just kind of in this road together. Becoming Catholic, I realized no, no, no. Protestants really have grave errors, and so if an Anglican who holds on to a view of the real presence but doesn't really believe in transubstantiation, who believes
mhm,
that the Mass is a sacrifice but of praise and not of propitiation, which again, that's the
mhm,
teaching of the Anglican Church. Um, who believes that the priest stands in for the person of Christ but doesn't act in persona Christi. Um, and he just goes, "Oh well, the new mass seems great. I could really become Catholic." I mean, we'd hope that he'd be catechized, and sometimes that happens, but
mhm.
it also might not happen. I've met people who converted from Anglicanism or Lutheranism a
Sure, yeah,
long time ago because they were boomers and they married this person or whatever, and they still hold on to their Protestant beliefs
yeah. Mhm.
without realizing, thinking that it's just what the Catholic Church is just kind of cool with it.
Sure, sure, sure. Yeah,
That's
yeah.
really dangerous to me. I think that the new mass is a part of the reason why that can happen. I
Mhm,
don't blame every problem in the church on the new mass. I don't think
mhm.
that there are Catholics and then there's Novus Ordites and like
That's
I don't think
good. Yeah, yeah.
but I do think that the Novus Ordo itself is really missing something.
Mhm.
Many things that make it less
Sure.
Catholic and more Protestant. I think it's Protestant and Protestantizing in certain ways.
Gotcha. Okay. I do have a couple more interesting questions. So one is on the Pius XII revision to Holy Week. My understanding is that the SSPX accepts that, and they, for the most part, use the revised Holy Week.
Correct.
Is that so? Would you say the reason they do that is because they've like evaluated those changes and they've decided, these changes are acceptable, or is it a principled position on? Because I guess what I'm wondering is like, okay, so they accept that a pope could change the mass to an extent where it becomes dangerous, but they don't believe Pius XII did that. Why do they believe that?
That's a good question. I think like if you were to talk to, I think most SSPX priests would say, I think it's unfortunate that the change happened. I don't think it was the best or whatever. I
Okay, okay.
personally, I personally kind of prefer the newer kind.
Oh, interesting. Okay, okay. Wow.
It's interesting. It's like I could probably get a lot of flack for that, but
Well, I've
it's
heard,
my
I've heard both. I've heard both sides, and it's interesting. So I go to an institute chapel, but I have Angelus Press missal, and they
hmm
talk about like the Holy Week, and the way it is they describe is that this is like a restoration of Holy Week versus like a, I don't know. So I don't really know the history. I know there was some like changes up and down, like weird and stuff, but yeah, go ahead and continue. I was more wondering. They say it's unfortunate, but they don't say it goes to the extent of like this is a problem.
Yeah, I think a lot of them would be like, oh, I really would prefer that, and
Hmm.
that's kind of the extent of it. So again, the church teaches, the SSPX affirms
Hmm.
that the Roman pontiff does have the prerogative to change the liturgy. in so much
Mhm.
as, again, as Pius XII says, what does he say? Provided that the integrity of doctrine be safeguarded.
Mhm.
Um, the the changes to the pre-55 Holy Week, which I'm not terribly familiar with,
Mhm.
because there's even some, as far as I know, it's like different iterations of it, I guess.
Mhm.
But uh, you might say, man, like there's a lot of beautiful things that it used to do that it doesn't do. Um,
Mhm.
uh, and I think the fraternity still has certain fraternity parishes have the permission to use the older form, which is really cool. I
Right,
think
and
it's great.
Stu does as well, yeah, so that's
Okay, okay, yeah,
because
I
because I
wasn't
because
aware
I
of
was
that.
at the Easter Vigil, and, my Angelus Press Missal didn't have all the stuff, and I was like, "Oh, okay." So, yeah.
Yeah, you probably there for like 8 hours or something. Like,
Yeah, it was
man,
like 12 readings, and I think the
it's the,
1962 has, like, 5 or something like that,
yeah.
but yeah.
Um, Sorry, I kind of did get off. I'm getting off track here, but
Yeah.
basically, yeah, in principle, we know that the Roman Pontiff can do that,
Mhm.
and we could say, I would, I don't think that's prudential or whatever. Like an example that even the society has talked about, and Archbishop Lev talked about, like
Mhm.
if the Pope just said, "Hey, all the readings are going to be in the vernacular," for example.
Mhm.
Now he did a much more extreme thing than that, but if he just said that, um, cool. Like that, I think that's sad, but he has the prerogative to do that.
Mhm.
We're going to go with it. Um, so again, it's like there is an argument
Mhm.
about private judgment, but
Right, that's kinda where I'm going, yeah, yeah.
yeah, I think that, and this is one of the things that he talked about, is that he didn't claim to make any dogmatic proclamation. So even when these priests are using strong language, some of them even more strong than Archbishop Lefebvre, um, he was making a prudential decision, and the argument would go something like this: there are X number of things with the new mass that are concerning, that seem to undermine, some in some way maybe go against the Catholic faith. Um, Whether you agree with that or not, if we accept that or grant that position for a second,
Mhm.
I'm going to go with the safe route and just say I know that the traditional mass is good. Like it can't not be because it's been accepted for so long with so many holy popes. It's made so many saints. It has all this background to it. The kind of the approval of so many pontiffs. Um, and it's the evidence is clear. It's thoroughly Catholic. I'm going to go the safe route. And
Mhm.
as he began to see more and more issues with the new mass, as it was celebrated, as it was implemented, but even in the text itself, as he began to understand it better, he said, "Okay, I'm not going to permit my seminarians to pray this mass
Mhm.
uh, when they become priests." Like,
Yeah.
and he just kind of he saw it as a prudential judgment, and then there's certain implications from that as we've gone on. That it's like,
Mhm.
because again, you couldn't make an argument in 1974 that the new mass, uh, you know, statistically hurt people because you don't know that there's not the numbers. Now I think there's
Mhm.
a decent argument. Again, it's like causation versus correlation,
Sure, sure, yeah, yeah.
but it seems pretty strong to say that like the traditional mass seems to have better retention rates in the Catholic faith,
Sure.
more orthodoxy, all these things, like to a
Yeah.
great um,
I wanna get back to kind of the core of my question, 'cause, it was interesting that the way you described the revision of the Holy Week, where you said, like, "Oh, it's kind of unfortunate, like, we lost a lot of things, I wish we didn't do it, it wasn't prudential." That's kind of the way I view the Novus Ordo, like,
yeah,
that's
yeah.
kind of that's and it seems so, and it basically what it seems like you're saying is, like, okay, it's a similar thing, but it's to a much greater extent, to the point where we have to, you know, make a call. I guess I'm wondering, because isn't it true that the SSPV was formed because priests were kicked out of Lefebvre's seminary because they refused the 1962 missal?
Uh, I don't know which group it is, whether it's the
Yeah,
SSPV or
yeah.
but there are certain groups.
Yeah,
Yeah, with the American in the American seminary, 9 priests and
right.
seminarians left, and
So I
yes,
guess I'm
yeah.
just wondering if a priest makes that decision, like, "I think this 1962 missal goes too far, it removes too many things," and refuses to say it. In your mind, is that just kinda like an agree to disagree? or is there something about like because Lefebvre seemed to be insistent on like we need to be faithful to this missal because the Pope gave it to us,
Mhm.
right? Does that make sense? My
Yeah,
kind of
yeah.
where I'm going. Yeah, yeah.
I think I see where you're going. So, like, there's a difference. First of all, in kind, because the 1962 missile is. This might be controversial, or we might have some back and forth about this, but I think it. There's an argument to be said that it is the Gregorian rite. So, like Pope Saint Gregory, and even before, uh, essentially moved it to the place where we have this central Roman rite. We could trace a lot of the canon back to him, all these things.
Mm-hmm.
And then Pius the Fifth canonized it as the Mass of Pius the Fifth, the Tridentine Mass that we refer to. The 1962 Missal is another edition of that Mass. The new Mass is not a reform of the 1962 Missal. It's a new rite, Novus Ordo. It's a new order of Mass um, that is invented.
Mm-hmm.
So it takes parts, like it retains certain things from the tradition, um, but it's invented. So I don't think we can make a comparison between saying,
Mm-hmm.
"Oh, if you reject the 1962 missile," it's like, no, no, that's because you're rejecting the Pope's authority to make these changes. Whereas the other one is saying the Pope invented, he didn't actually invent, but he codified an invented liturgy that was created with Protestants in mind. That's a clear fact. There were six. This again, there's kind of misinformation about this. There were six Protestant observers who, according to Bunini, did have a part in decisions and formulating the Mass. So it was made with Protestants in mind, and so that's in that sense we call it Protestant, not in every sense, but um, so it's like it's two different things to say.
Mm-hmm.
No, no, I'm rejecting like John the 23rd couldn't add Saint Joseph to the canon. It's like no, no, no.
Mm-hmm.
The Council of Trent is clear that pontiffs can add to the Roman canon.
Mm-hmm.
Whether they can take away is a different question, but at least
Mm-hmm.
it's said that pontiffs can add to the Roman canon. And the changes in Holy Week, a lot of those were. This is going to be oversimplifying, and I'm sorry for those who know more, but it's like changes of color and liturgical vestment, changes of the time of certain masses, the amount of readings which are not part of the mass, like the readings in the Easter Vigil are before the mass. The
Right.
mass
Yeah.
starts, it's well in the new calendar it starts at midnight.
Mm-hmm.
I think it starts at noon in
Yeah. It's really early on. Yeah.
like crazy. But my point is like those things aren't part of the mass. They're connected to the mass, but clearly you can choose the pontiff has the right to change what readings are read. Um, Notice that like when we might make criticisms of the lectionary, the new lectionary, we don't say that the Pope doesn't have the right to decide what readings are in the mass, what part of the Bible is in the mass. We
Mm-hmm.
say, oh, it's really unfortunate that these hard truths are removed.
Mm-hmm.
These verses that are hard to swallow for a lot of people are removed from the lectionary. We don't say the Pope can't choose what readings are going to be in the Mass.
Mm-hmm.
So we'd say the same thing about the pre-55 Holy Week. It's like, yeah, the Pope has the right to do that. He is the Supreme Pontiff, and
Mm-hmm.
we do submit to him. I mean, I think hopefully by tomorrow they should have it, but like, until the Holy Father's death, Pope Francis was his image was the first thing you see when you walk into the SSPX seminary. It's a big
Right.
picture of
Right.
him. And then the opposing side, you see the superior general of the society, because that's what you do when you have a
Mm.
religious, when you have a congregation. Um, I hope that
So.
by the time we get to Pope Leo's face will be up there.
Mhm.
Like we
Yeah. Yeah.
believe in the Pope.
Yeah. No. And yeah. I understand. I guess that leads me to an interesting question. Would you say Pope Paul VI had the right to change the things he did, or were there certain things he changed that he did not have the right to do? Kind of a
I
tricky
would
question, but I'm
say
interested how you would answer that.
I would say that the sovereign pontiff has the right to make the changes, provided only that the integrity of her doctrine be safeguarded. And I don't think we can say that about the new mass. So I think that
You
Pius the
you would
20th.
you would look at certain parts and say, okay, he had the right to change that, but the other parts you're like, I don't think he had the right to change that.
Yeah, and again, it is
Okay. Yeah.
difficult, and I acknowledge it's
I
difficult
was
to.
just curious. It wasn't even like a gotcha. It was more of like a curiosity thing. Yeah. Yeah.
No, no, no. I like the question though because it's
Mhm.
like it is important to say, again, like I said before about genuflections, like,
Hmm.
did all the six have the right to remove this genuflection and this
Hmm.
one, this, like, what's the number? That's not the argument. It's
Hmm.
important to say it is a cumulative argument. So there is something about a number, like I think it is helpful to realize that somewhere between 70 and 85% of the prayers are either gone or changed.
Hmm.
Uh, Referencing your old video, that doesn't mean that there's 75% more graces in
Right.
the
Yeah.
mass.
Yeah.
But I think it's important to think about those things and realize
Hmm.
like the scope of the change, because so many Catholics,
Hmm.
maybe not so much recently, but so many Catholics just thought that the new mass was the translation of the traditional mass.
Into English. Yeah. Yeah.
But my point is, like, what it's like the fallacy of the beard, which is
Hmm.
embarrassing for me to be mentioning that right now. But like, what point does something become a beard? What point does it become
Hmm.
not preserving this, or safeguarding the integrity of the doctrine? It's hard to say, but I
Hmm.
think we can say that offertory, communion, consecration, communion in the hand that was allowed, all these different things that I could list. Or let me just kind of give a quote to summarize this thought.
Sure. Yeah.
This is from Cardinal Ottaviani. It's a very famous quote from the Ottaviani intervention. He is a cardinal who lived and died in the church. There's none of this weird, question.
Hmm.
And he says that the Novus Ordo represents, both as a whole and in its details, a striking departure from the Catholic theology of the Mass as it was formulated by the 22nd session of the Council of Trent. Uh, I think that describes it very well. Like, Paul VI does not have the right to depart from the theology of the Mass as defined dogmatically by the
Hmm.
Council of Trent.
Yeah. The only thing I would add, since you brought up Ottaviani, since he obviously went on to celebrate the new mass, right? He retracted. He didn't. I wouldn't say he retracted, but it was essentially he submitted a dubium, right? And then he kind of got an answer, is my
Yeah,
understanding.
I'm not super familiar.
Something like that. But I'll
Yeah,
just read one quote just to bounce out your quote, just so the audience is getting it.
yeah.
Because he said, after, I guess, studying the new mass, I've rejoiced profoundly to read the discourse by the Holy Father on the question of the new Ordo Missae, and especially the doctrinal precisions contained in his discourses at the public audiences. After which I believe no one can longer be genuinely scandalized. As for the rest, a prudent and intelligent catechesis must be undertaken to solve some legitimate perplexities which the text is capable of arousing. So basically saying,
I'm sorry. Can you read that last part again? I missed the last part.
as for the rest, a prudent and intelligent catechesis must be undertaken to solve some legitimate perplexities which the text is capable of arousing. So he's saying, like, okay, there's these things I was concerned about. I'm still a little bit concerned that it can be misinterpreted, but after studying it, I don't think there's anything intrinsically wrong. It's kind of the vibe I'm getting from him. But
Yeah,
um, yeah.
and
Anyway,
clearly him and Archbishop Lefebvre came to different conclusions. But it
right?
is
Yeah.
interesting that they share not only in the previous, the earlier text, which Archbishop
Hmm.
Lefebvre, SSPX priest, loved to quote the
Yeah.
first
Yeah.
text from Ottaviani and not the second. Um, but Cardinal Ottaviani is acknowledging, like, hey, even though I accept this, and I think that you can clarify, kind of like the hermeneutic of continuity before it
Right.
exists.
Yeah. Yeah.
You can make these things fit, just like Archbishop Lefebvre. Like, it's not heretical, but
Hmm.
Archbishop Lefebvre would say it favors heresy. Ottaviani would say it arise, legitimate perplexities
Yeah.
arise. I think that there's
Lefebvre
something.
would say avoid it. Ottaviani would say we need to make sure we're doing a lot of catechesis so that people don't misunderstand. It's kind of the
Yeah,
maybe there. Yeah.
yeah. I think that there's an argument to be made that, given the privilege that we have of looking back in history,
Hmm.
there's an argument to be made that Archbishop Lefebvre was on the right side of that disagreement, because we see the the damage that has been done in a lot of places. I mean, in a lot of dioceses. Not to mention, when all these holy pontiffs are talking about how the church could not be wrong. A lot of the time, they reference the church could not be wrong about its liturgy for so many centuries. So many saints. It's referencing the
Hmm.
continuity of tradition. And now to have a holy father, I had the wonderful privilege of meeting Pope Francis briefly. I shook his
Oh
hand.
wow.
It was wonderful. I prayed for him. I prayed for him. We prayed for him with the rosary. We pray for his soul now. But to have a pope who so clearly um, did not reverence the traditional mass in the same way that his predecessors did,
Hmm.
like all of them, from like at least Pius V to Pius XII, um, it's really, really concerning, and it raises absurd questions of like, you know, with Traditionis Custodes and things like
Hmm.
that. It's like, do you have an authentic sense of the Catholicity of this mass? Because Pope Francis isn't saying, "Oh yeah, the new mass has perplexities and questions that need to be answered." He's saying this is the normative right.
Hmm.
This is what we should understand. And it's like if these cardinals and these bishops and these had these
Hmm.
questions to begin with, shouldn't we really address those? And I'm open to the reform of the reform idea to some extent,
Hmm.
but at least to say, um, can we make the new mass more clear about these issues that it hasn't been
Hmm.
clear about?
Sure. Yeah. And
That's
to
my
be fair,
opinion, not the
yeah,
SSPX. I'm
yeah, yeah,
defending that.
gotcha. No, and this is a good place to end because we have a lot of agreement on Church Custodes. I think was potentially very terrible, but
Of course,
um, yeah, I think, and obviously, I
unjust,
think it could even be great. What was that?
unjust, I would say.
Unjust. That would be a fair, yeah. Um, I think it's very possible that even Pope Leo, let's say, could make a new edition of the Missal, right? The 2025 Mass of
Which is
Pope Leo,
crazy.
and he could
Yeah.
make it way more base or whatever. Like I don't know. So yeah, there's a lot there to be said. I do have one more question, and you may not have the answer to this, but I've heard. So I've watched some episodes of the SSPX podcast where they talk about diocesan TLMs and then institute and fraternity, and
Uh-huh.
they talk about how they advise against going for all the reasons they stated, basically the doctrinal differences, the whatever. Do you happen to know, do they go as far as to say that if your only mass option is a diocesan institute or fraternity that you can stay home, or do they say you should still go? Do you happen
No.
to know?
So yeah, yeah. So again, this is an area where when it comes to the exact advice, you might get varying degrees,
Okay, yeah.
but the general thrust would be the the times when you can lawfully miss Sunday Mass are, of course, the physical impossibility of going to Mass. You just can't make it.
Hmm.
Uh, there's obligations of charity. My sick wife is, here. I have to take care of the children.
Hmm.
I can't go to Mass.
Hmm.
And then there's obligations of the faith, which would be, you're dispensed if you have uh, like if you know or have a reasonable understanding that the priest teaches heresy, for example.
Hmm.
Another example would be if you know with reasonable certainty that the priest uh, does liturgical abuse, like uh, a parish that will be unnamed in my hometown. Um, a number of them that I can think of practice like what you and I would agree egregious liturgical abuse, um, very bad things.
Hmm.
Um, and you are not obliged to go to mass if that's your only option. But the one about doctrine is interesting. So some SSPX priests would be even more cautious than others. But the general advice is the thrust of the advice is you should not, because they've accepted the what they would perceive to be the errors of Vatican II, which could be a whole other
Hmm.
episode. I hope we might
Exactly, yeah.
have. Um, uh, the the perceived errors of Vatican II, because they've inculcated those, they're likely to preach them. And so, if you have good reason to think that that priest at a local parish, fraternity priest, does that regularly, then they would say that you are dispensed. That's one area where I think I agree with what they're saying, but I think that there's a little bit more nuance to be had. But essentially, unless you have that good reason, you're not dispensed from the obligation to go to mass. So
Right.
if the traditional mass or an Eastern Catholic parish,
Hmm.
I would say you should go until proven otherwise. Now, if you go
Hmm.
there and you hear, all religions are actively willed by God or whatever it may
Right, right.
be, then you might have to start considering not. But I think, last thing I'll say about that is the greater point is they're saying like you should try to find a mass in which you can confidently say that the church's teaching will be passed on. The fraternity parish that is closest to me, I love the priest there. I have never heard anything that was really questionable, except maybe their uh, one priest who was there for a short time was talking about the SSPX. I didn't like his take on it, but that was
Yeah,
my
yeah.
private thing. But the
Mhm,
pastor there is, very supportive of the SSPX, and so it's
mhm.
interesting. But I'll leave that there.
Yeah, gotcha. Cool. Well, this was super awesome, man. I really appreciate you coming on. Really lively discussion. I don't know if you mentioned this before we started recording or not. You said you found you're like a fan of my channel, so I'm glad that's the case. If I ever make jokes with the SSPX in the future, it's not personal. I make fun of everyone, so I hope you
Yeah,
keep
yeah.
keep
I
watching.
would be offended if you didn't. I think.
There you go. Okay.
Yeah. I will say I'm going to pick one bone with you before we go, and it's
Okay.
when you had Andrew. What's his last name? The
Mione.
Alter against Alter. Yes, yeah, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Hmm.
Um, the premise of the game was that you were having basically like traditionalist nonsense, but
Hmm.
you went to just random quotes, and I was like, man, you can find anything out there, and I was like, the amount of stuff in that video where SSPX priests would be like, that's insane, don't ever say that. I was watching
Yeah.
those. How can you do that? All in
Yeah, and
good
that's
faith.
why.
I'm just
Yeah,
kidding.
yeah. Which is why I wouldn't call it like SSPX quote real or fake because like that'd be kind of unfair to put any of those onto them. Like,
I think that was the title of the video.
was it or was it? If I use clickbait, maybe I should change the title, and that's totally fair.
Yeah, that was all. That was it.
I got you. No, totally fair. Yeah, sweet. Anything else? I know you said you don't have a platform, so there's probably nothing for you to plug. Anything you want to say before we end?
Pray for my family. No, I mean, I would just say, pray for Pope Francis, Pope Leo. He has got a hard mission, and pray for the faithful in the Diocese of Charlotte. I'm in the Richmond Diocese.
Hmm.
We have our own problems, our own troubles, but the Diocese of Charlotte is, I think, really experiencing a sort of persecution from their own bishop, which is really
Hmm.
very sad. So pray for them.
Very good. All right. Well, everyone who's watching, have a great night. We'll see you next time.